Overnight, the weather changed throughout the entire process. In a small town in Pennsylvania, USA, a virus even more terrifying than Ebola was leaked. In order to prevent the virus from leaking out, the military sent buses to isolate all residents. The muddled residents had no idea what was happening and were isolated like livestock by soldiers. Once soldiers discover symptoms of fever, regardless of gender, age, they will be forcibly taken away and tied to hospital beds one by one. They will be forced to inhale lychee pills for horsemouth cleaning, and in severe cases, they will be directly subjected to high-temperature treatment. What virus is it that makes them so cautious? 3 days ago, a baseball game was being held in the small town when suddenly an uncle burst into the field with a shotgun. The originally joyful atmosphere suddenly became tense. Sheriff Dawei noticed something was wrong and quickly stepped forward to dissuade him. He thought the uncle was just drinking too much and going crazy. Unexpectedly, the uncle directly aimed his gun at Dawei and tried to pull the trigger. The tragedy came unprepared. The residents all know that uncle is a well-known old man in the town, who is proud of himself. How could he make such a move today? David suspected that uncle might have been drinking fake alcohol, but the forensic examination showed that uncle's blood had no alcohol content and there were no signs of drug use. Uncle's wife also said that he quit drinking 2 years ago. How can we say he caused trouble while drinking? Faced with the deceased, his wife slapped him angrily. David felt both guilty and aggrieved. If it weren't for his quick hand movements, it was likely that he was lying inside now. But at night, strange things happened again. A man locked his wife and children inside the house, then scattered his wife all the way outside. Finally, he lit a match and burned his wife and children alive inside. When David arrived at the scene, the food had already spread throughout the entire house. But strangely enough, the killer stood in place like a piece of wood without speaking or running away. David saw this and had to bring the man back to the police station first. On the other hand, several residents were hunting in the forest when they suddenly discovered a damaged parachute hanging from a tree. They pulled up the rope and saw that it was actually a corpse. After receiving the alarm, David immediately rushed to the scene and determined that the deceased was a pilot based on their attire. So David and his assistant searched around the lake and indeed found a crashed plane at the bottom of the river not far away. It's strange that the newspaper and news didn't report on such a big accident. Although Dawei didn't know what secrets were hidden on the plane, he firmly believed that the recent events must be related to the crashed plane, because all the drinking water in the town came from rivers, and he speculated that there was a problem with the water source. David immediately investigated the water supply diagram and found that the uncle who was initially killed was indeed the closest suspect to the water source. In order to prevent more people from being infected, David came to the mayor at the first time, hoping that the mayor would temporarily cut off the water supply system and make a decision on whether to supply water after investigating the situation. But the mayor does not think so, because it is currently the farming season. If the water source is closed, crops will wither, which will cause huge losses to the town. Therefore, he firmly does not agree to close the water source. Watching the mayor's firm attitude, Dawei knew it was a waste of saliva. So, taking the risk of dereliction of duty, he pried open the iron gate of the water supply valve and personally closed it to prevent anyone from opening the valve again to drain water, even removing the handle of the valve. However, when they returned to the police station, they found the detained man lying motionless on the ground, with blood vessels clearly visible on his face. Just as the two were discussing whether the man had died, the man suddenly turned into a loss. David realized that things were not simple, so he wanted to call and notify him to get on the phone, but not only could the phone not be connected, but even the network signal was cut off. He walked outside with his phone looking for a signal, but there was still no signal on half a grid. What's even more strange is that the once bustling small town has now become empty. At this moment, there was a sudden sound coming from the autopsy room. David rushed in to investigate, but when he arrived at the morgue, he did not see the forensic doctor's figure. Instead, he found a man with his eyes and mouth sewn together. David nervously picked up scissors to help the man when suddenly he was knocked down by the forensic doctor from behind. Before David could recover, the forensic doctor attacked with a cutting machine. Fortunately, David reacted quickly and waved the cutting machine, all of which were cleverly avoided by David. In the end, he seized the opportunity to pull up the underground wires and entangle the forensic doctor. So, the forensic doctor was killed by himself, but the chainsaw in his hand was like a navigation device, heading straight to the Great Black Root. Fortunately, Assistant Jack arrived in time, which saved David Hagen's life. David realized that something even more terrifying would happen next, so he went home and asked his wife to pack up and prepare to return to his mother's house. But before they left, they were arrested by a group of masked soldiers coming to their door. Then he and his wife were both taken to a bus. Not just them, but also the entire town residents were arrested and sent to a temporary isolation zone set up by the military. Fully armed soldiers tested everyone's temperature here, and residents with signs of fever were isolated separately. David's wife was found to have abnormal body temperature due to pregnancy, and the soldiers forcibly dragged him away. David still wanted to make a final struggle, but was knocked unconscious by a soldier's stock. Then, medical staff gave his wife general anesthesia and placed him in a dimly lit room. The residents lying here are all residents whose body temperature has been measured to be abnormal. When Dawei woke up from his small black room, he suddenly heard gunshots coming from outside. It turned out that it was a resident driving in and breaking through the guardrail of the quarantine area. The residents also fled from the quarantine area one after another upon seeing this. The soldiers saw that the situation in the quarantine zone was completely lost and evacuated directly by helicopter. Dawei and Jack also took advantage of the situation and fled back to the police station, then brought their weapons and prepared to rescue Suihua. At this moment, Suihua, who was tied to the hospital bed, also woke up. Unfortunately, an infected person holding a steel fork walked over, which frightened the person tied to the hospital bed and made them afraid to take a breath. Only death was waiting for them. Male, the steel fork in his hand kept thrusting towards the residents' bodies, and Suihua couldn't help but plead in her mouth as she saw her turn approaching. Just as the steel fork in the man's hand was about to fall, 2 gunshots suddenly knocked him down. It turned out that Jack and David had rushed over in time, which temporarily lifted the crisis. Suihua quickly untied the neighbor who was bound beside her. When they arrived outside, they found corpses and debris everywhere, and all the vehicles were on fire. They had to walk back to Dawei's house on foot because there was an old police car in Dawei's house. However, as they passed by a warehouse, they found fully armed soldiers entering the house in search of survivors. But this time it's not about sending them to quarantine, but shooting them directly and then disinfecting them with high-temperature firearms, which makes them realize that living people are more dangerous than infected people. When the few people returned to David's house, it was already early the next morning, but they didn't plan to take a break. They simply picked up some supplies and hurriedly drove away from the town. They didn't go too far, they just saw a military helicopter on the road. Dawei stepped on the gas pedal and drove directly into a car wash shop to avoid helicopter tracking. But as soon as they stopped the car, the washing equipment suddenly started running automatically, and the wheels got stuck on the track. Even if David only hit the gas pedal, he couldn't leave. This is an ambush where infected individuals begin to launch attacks. After a desperate resistance, the car finally drove out. However, the crisis did not end when an infected person suddenly appeared under the car, tying the wires around the neighbor's neck. Dawei quickly brakes, throws the infected person down, and then shoots them one by one to kill them. Unfortunately, the saved neighbor is no longer breathing. Just as a few people were still feeling sad, suddenly a shell directly destroyed their car. Although they narrowly escaped the disaster, their only means of transportation was also destroyed, and they had to continue walking in the hot weather. When they were searching for supplies on the roadside, they suddenly noticed a police car driving ahead, and Dawei and Jack immediately shot down the roadblock. The out-of-control police car instantly flipped over the roadside, and the two quickly ran over to check. The driver was only slightly injured and was not in any serious condition. David immediately approached to inquire with the chief about what had happened in the town. The chief will no longer conceal it and tell them the truth. It turned out that the crashed plane was being transported as a defense for our country, but the prototype of the virus was originally intended to be sent to another military base, but unexpectedly crashed into this small town. This virus can make people lose their sanity. Once infected, it will mutate within 2 days, and there is no cure for this virus. In order to prevent the virus from leaking globally, they have to be aware of all the residents in the small town. David originally wanted to ask the uninfected residents how to deal with it, but suddenly Jack shot and killed him. David instantly felt Jack's abnormal behavior, thinking that Jack might have been infected. For safety reasons, David had to find an excuse to confiscate his weapon. Jack didn't say much either. When they arrived at the entrance of the highway, they found that it had already been blocked by soldiers. When Jack knew he might be infected, he decided to sacrifice himself to cover their escape. David saw Jack's firm attitude, so he handed the pistol to him. After a brief farewell, Jack walked over without hesitation, but he didn't even have a chance to shoot and was directly killed by the soldiers. But this successfully caught the attention of the soldiers and created an opportunity for David and the others to escape. They ran along the highway all the way, and when they arrived at a service area, they found it chaotic. Looking at the bullet casings on the ground and the charred bodies on the truck, they completely realized that the so-called isolation was a lie of the military. Unexpectedly, in order to prevent the virus from leaking, they massacred all the residents of the town. Now they must find a way out of here as soon as possible. Later, while searching for supplies, David discovered a military lost walkie-talkie on the countertop, constantly reporting that there were still 10 minutes left until the countdown. Although David didn't know what it meant, it was definitely not a good thing. The two of them found a truck ready to leave, but just as David was taking the key from the body, an infected person with a weapon appeared in front of him. David was about to turn around and get into the car when a hand suddenly appeared under the car and pulled him down. Suehua wanted to get off the car to help, but the infected person with a gun pulled the trigger at him. Under the car, Dawei wrestled with the other person, and the infected person with a gun also approached Suehua step by step. When he opened the door, Suehua, who was hiding in the back seat, shot and solved it with one shot. At this point, David under the car had already fallen into the disadvantageous position and was soon beaten to a bruised and swollen face. Seeing the other party attacking again, David quickly stood up, pushed the iron gun containing flammable materials onto the infected person, and then took out a lighter and threw it directly to the ground. As the flammable material was ignited, the raging fire instantly engulfed the infected person. After the crisis was resolved, the two of them also drove a truck out of here. At this moment, the countdown came from the walkie-talkie again, and they didn't know what would happen when the countdown ended. David didn't dare to delay the full speed prospect for a moment. Trigger engagement 22322. As the countdown came to an end, a nuclear bomb exploded in the town, and the powerful airflow instantly overturned the truck. After everything calmed down, both of them miraculously survived. When they looked towards the direction of the town again, the mushroom clouds in the sky made people shudder. I didn't expect the military to use this method to control the spread of the virus and even mistake their country for Japan. At the end of the story, the two of them walked hand in hand towards another city. But what they don't know is that the government's satellites have already locked them in, and although they haven't been infected, they don't rule out the possibility of carrying the virus. They have headed towards the city and are likely to become the next target of government bombing.